ago, a cousin of mine took me overseas. London, Paris, and Rome. And of course we did all the touristy things. I had been to the UK before, but never to Paris or Rome, and so I really wanted to cash in, focusing on cash because my cousin was paying for everything. I really wanted to cash in on this trip and see all the sights there were to see. So it was the Eiffel Tower and the Notre Dame, and when we got to Rome it was the Colosseum and the Vatican, etc., etc. But there was a particular place in Paris that haunted me quite a bit. It was the Church of the Sacred Heart, also famously known as the Sacré-Cœur. It's in Montmartre, and of course that's where all the artists hang out with their canvases, doing their paintings and so on and so forth. Of course, on the day that I arrived there, the vernacular wasn't working. So I had to ascend the 116 steps to actually get to the cathedral. I was much fitter than I am now, and I still had my gallbladder, so it wasn't too heavy a task. I got up there quite comfortably, and of course oohed and awed at the exquisite beauty of Sacré-Cœur. It ticked all the boxes as far as impressive churches go. I stared at the marble altar, and I was stunned by all the statues and the beautiful things to be seen in a cathedral. When I entered there, something wrapped itself around my heart. I didn't know exactly what it was at the time, but I just knew deep down that this place is very, very special. Walked around a bit and took my photos at the high altar, and I remember my cousin shouting at me because apparently that's an inappropriate thing to do, to take a photo at the high altar, but I mean, there wasn't a cardinal who could see, so I suppose I got away with it. As we walked out of the church, I came face to face with something that made me know why my heart had responded so profoundly to just seemingly another church in Europe. There was this big post outside attached to one of the columns saying to the reader that on that site, for the last 125 years, some monks had been praying in the vault of the church. Not once a week, not even once a day, but full time. 24/7, 365 a year. Apparently, that's what they felt called to do in the late Victorian era, and here they were, a century and a quarter on, still doing that. Calling upon the name of God, seeking His face, losing themselves in the wonder of prayer. And I thought to myself when the penny dropped, that's it. That is what makes this church so special. That is what makes that place so extraordinary. Surely that is what my heart answered in reply. And so I suppose if one goes there today, 13 years on, making the calculation, that sign would probably read, for the last 138 years, monks have been praying here day and night. How unusual and how precious. My mind couldn't help itself but to go to Queen Victoria's favourite hymn, "The Day Thou Gavest, Lord, is Ended." It is the official hymn for the Women's World Day of Prayer. We sing it every March when women globally gather to pray. It was a hymn dear to Her Majesty's heart because she was head of an empire on which the sun never set. And in that third verse, something must have been very valuable to old Queen Vic when she sang these words of the third verse of John Allerton's hymn: as o'er each continent and island the dawn leads on another day. She was clearly thinking of all her colonies and British territories far flung across the world. But then the hymn author says the following: the voice of prayer is never silent, nor dies the strain of praise away. At any given time, somewhere, someone in the world is praying, talking to God, either praising His name or thanking Him for life and health, or perhaps making known to Him an urgent request for help and provision. It's quite an amazing thought, quite overwhelming to think that God has to, on a daily basis, hour to hour, minute by minute, has to handle all these cries that rise to His throne. 3 weeks ago, I preached a sermon on prayer, and you seem to have enjoyed it. In fact, that's what you told me. And so I half promised you a sermon series on prayer. Remember that? But then I had to go to hospital, and last week we had to deal with the hospice people visiting us. And so today is my first opportunity to live up to that expectation, unpacking the whole theme of prayer, even if only a little bit. Now, I'm supposed to build on what I said to you 21 days ago. So I trust that everybody knows exactly what my 3 points were on the 6th of October, and I can now give you the second installment on our series on prayer. What's that nervous chuckling I'm picking up? Okay, you know what? I'm just going to make this whole scene easier. I'm just going to give you my 3 points of 3 weeks ago so that we can be A-ful away and actually get somewhere this morning. So my 3 points on the 6th of October on prayer were: number one, when you pray, let God be God. For goodness sake, don't try and usurp His throne. Don't try and replace Him with yourself in your own life. Let God be God. And what's more is what I said is, let God be your God. Secondly, we talked about how we need to recognize our need for Him. Whenever we go on our knees, it's probably wise, it's probably helpful to start with this recognition: Lord, I am actually, I hate to admit it, desperate for You. Lord, I actually can't manage giving one step in the right direction without You showing me the way. Sometimes our prayers are too proud, too arrogant, too self-sufficient. We want to recognize our need for God, but we also want to sort out our own stuff. And I'm just not sure if that can be called faith. Sometimes faith is spelled R-I-S-K. The last thing I said in that sermon was, and I always seem to keep the best for last, I did give you the guarantee that every prayer is heard. There wasn't time on the day, because you know me, I'm always so darn verbose, I just go on and on and on. So I had to tweak that last point. I wanted to talk about how every prayer is heard and how every prayer is answered, but we never had the chance to unpack that. And I was actually glad afterwards when I realized that I would have put my foot in it when I talked about every prayer is heard and every prayer is answered, because chances are that some of you would have misinterpreted what I was trying to say. For you would have heard that I said that every prayer is answered in the way that you demand. And that wasn't where I was going to go. It wasn't where I was going to go at all. What I was going to say, if it wasn't 11:15 at the time, What I was going to say was that every prayer is heard and every prayer is answered with the disclaimer that sometimes, oftentimes, the answers are not what we would have chosen or preferred. And perhaps today I can put in a little bit of an explanation of what I mean when I say that. I've had to teach myself over many, many years not to become too disgruntled when God doesn't give me what I want. For God is, after all, not in existence to please Bevan Sylvester. God doesn't live to be at my beck and call. And so, every time I fall so flat on my face with a messed up prayer life, I have to pull myself together and remind myself that I'm not the only person in the universe. I think it's quite important to bring yourself to a point where you acknowledge that other people have also received quite categorical no's from God. That if God happens to be saying no to you at this season in your life, that you are not the first person that that's ever happened to. Probably won't be the last either. I can never get over poor David's struggle with God. He struggled with God in the Old Testament. Now, I'm only going to continue with the sermon if you don't look as bored as you're looking right this minute. I cannot tell you what it takes of me to preach without notes. And I know it's something that means a lot to you, so I prepare accordingly and I come ready to share with you. But you need to give me more, okay? Smile every now and then, okay? Or grunt. Or take the risk of saying amen. Just every 5 minutes or so. I might overdo it now. You know what I'm saying? Okay, so are you up to the sermon or not? Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Pam. Thanks, Liz. Was that you, Monica? What did the amen come from you? Thank you, my dear friend. Okay, I think we are in for a way. You know what I've had to teach myself when it comes to getting a no from God? I've had to teach myself that I'm not unique. For there was this poor man in the Old Testament, David. And he was a king even, not that that brought him very far. Remember how David begged God for one single favor? David begged God to make him, David, the person to build the temple. David thought this would go down very well. David had even thought of what the plot with his name on would look like on the cornerstone. David had all sorts of fancy ideas, and David went to God in 1 Chronicles 28, and David says to God, you know what, God, I've heard that other nations and other tribes have special places dedicated to their God, and I think we must follow suit. How about me building you a house? And God's reply was, I don't think so. And then David went with a whole plan. He had consulted an architect to it. And David said, you know what, God, I'm even going to build my own brick factory. So we've got that sorted. You don't worry about any material. You just give the permission. And then we'll go ahead. David said to God, I even know where to get cement on special. And God still said a firm no. Can you imagine how disappointed David must have been? He wanted to be the man. He wanted this to be part of his legacy. He wanted to be remembered for at least something positive and not all the other shenanigans he had got up to. But God firmly said, sorry. Ain't gonna happen. It looks like God had an issue with his hands being blood-stained. You see, David was such a warmonger. God said, if you ever build me this glorious building that you already have an image of in your mind, it's going to kill my buzz a little bit. I can't have a dwelling place built with sullied hands. And so God waited for the throne to change and said to Solomon, you're the man. Find out from David where to get cement on this contract. If the whole example of David getting a no from God doesn't work for you, I've got an even more haunting example. There I take you to the Garden of Gethsemane. For there in the shadows you will see a man kneeling amidst the gnarled trees. He looks alone, for he is very alone. His friends had found a resting place lower down the slope. And so he's busy with very important business. On that crucial night, the Thursday on the Mount of Olives, 12 hours or so before the crucifixion, Jesus was having a soul battle second to none. He thought to himself, I need to find an easier plan. I was once upon a time ready for this, but now I'm not so sure. And so he went to his Father and he made his intercession, saying, Lord, how about it? How about you removing this bitter cup from me and finding a plan B? Luke tells us that the prayer was so intense that his sweat drops fell like blood to the ground. Not only did he ask this once, not only even twice, but 3 times he begged God to eradicate Calvary. But then eventually it dawned on him that there would be no other way. And so he prayed the most risky prayer ever recorded by man. Lord, still I want you to do not as I choose. Not my will be done, but thine. The battle was won in the garden. That's where his death march started. That's when he reached the point of no return. And there's an important lesson to be learned here. There's an important lesson of acceptance, an important lesson of faith, an important lesson of surrendering. There's an important lesson of saying to the Lord, you know what? I'm yours. Do with me whatever you want, whenever you want, with whomever you want. I've told you this story before of a little niece of mine. She was about 3 or 4 at the time, and I would visit them every Saturday. Her name's Kate, and I'm just looking at you, Kate, and I need a replacement name for my story. Kate is not a real name. You just happen to be sitting in front of me. So we'll call her Kate for now. And so I would visit Kate, and I would always have this custom of taking her a little something. Now, I've told you this story before, but it was on a rainy Sunday, so half of you weren't here. So just treat it as new material, okay? And I would always take her either a packet of Smarties or a packet of Skittles, the fruity flavored ones, or a packet of Jelly Tots. And I arrived there one Saturday afternoon, ready to jump with her on the trampoline and to have tea with her mother. But as I handed her little gift to her, for some or other reason on this particular day, she was very unhappy with what it was. For I had decided on Skittles. Yeah, over that weekend it was 2 for the price of 1, so if you now have to know. Anyway, she was desperately unhappy with the gift of Skittles. She clearly wanted Smarties or Jelly Tots or both, but they broke out a tantrum unlike I had ever seen before. And in between the snot and the tears, she managed to get these words out. "This is not what I was hoping for." And I said to myself, "Kate, you are 4 years old, if that, probably 3.5. What are you possibly hoping for?" And so the next week I took all 3. I just wanted to cover all my bases. That's how a 3-year-old gets it right to manipulate me. She got away with Skittles, Smarties, and Jelly Tots the following week. But here's what I learned as I drove away that day. You know what I thought to myself? I have so often been on my knees in tears, looking up at the sky, saying to God, what I've ended up with is not what I was hoping for. And unless you are a blatant liar, you have also, at some point in your life, spoken those words. Saying, "Lord, you're giving me Skittles. Are you there for something? I asked for Smarties." Or was it Jelly Tot? Sometimes we don't even ourselves remember what we've asked for. And so you know what? For me, this is what prayer could be. This is what prayer should be. Aligning yourself, your own will, to the will of God. And so often nowadays, instead of providing God with the shopping list, I ask Him to tune my heart to the same melody that rings in His heart. Many a time, my will does not run parallel to God's will. And so now I make it an intentional thing in my life to ask Him to not change His mind, but to work in my head so that my mind can be changed, so that my attitude can be altered, and so that my thinking can be transformed. Do we want a God who is a genie in a bottle? Do we want a God who is a wizard with a wand? A God who snaps His fingers every time we throw our toys? Or are we going to be okay with a God who says, trust my timing? A God who says, wait while I work out the purposes I've got for your life. A God who says to us, I've told you that I've got a plan, haven't I? I don't think a God who is a pushover can be trusted. I trust God more exactly because He hasn't given me everything I've asked for. That makes Him more trustworthy, not less. For you know what, if God had answered all my prayers by now, I would be married to a girl named Melissa. And you know what? If God had answered all my prayers, I would probably now be divorced from Melissa. So perhaps it's just as well that God doesn't give us everything we demand. I no longer seek to understand. It's just above me. I no longer try and make sense of God's weird and wonderful ways. I now try and build my trust in Him. To trust Him even when I cannot see. To trust Him even when I'm blinded by my pain. To trust Him even when I'm crippled by my fear. There's a hymn I hold very close to my heart. It's a Wesleyan hymn in the old Methodist book. It's called, How Do Thy Mercies Close Me Round? And the last verse goes, as follows, and I've given you this, but I've just remembered that it was on the same day I told you the story of Kate, which means that half of you weren't here because it was raining, so you need to treat this as new material. The last verse of Charles Wesley's hymn goes as follows. Me for thine own thou lovest to take, in time and in eternity. Thou never, never wilt forsake a helpless soul who trusts in thee. Some of you, I suspect, some of you are sitting here a little angry with God. Some of you are sitting here a bit upset. Because what you've been praying for since the 90s hasn't materialized. Perhaps one has to come to that rude awakening that God actually owes us nothing. You see, I used to also think that God has to answer my prayers in a way that I prefer. I've been serving Him all these years. I've been walking with Him since standard 8. And I work for Him, remember? Surely that must have built up some kind of brownie points. Surely I'm fractionally more favored than the average lay person. There's a project I run every December. It's called Joy to the World. I run it in Somerset West, and I started it in 1999. It's a food parcel project for the poor. I do it every December without fail. When I lived in other provinces, I would travel to Somerset West during Christmas time to actually run the project. And so surely God must be aware of how near and dear the less fortunate are to me. Surely that would make Him answer my prayers. I can write a list on what I achieved in the Methodist Church. I was quite an impactful minister when I served them for 13 years. Surely God knows my CV. Surely God knows how serious I am about His church. And surely that must make God change His mind. Surely that must make Him give Him what I want. I'm Bevan Sylvester after all. But God, in His infinite mercy, has promised us that there is a plan in place for our lives. And that if we ever want to make Him chuckle, we need to tell Him the plans we have for our lives. If you are in an angry place with God, if you are feeling frustrated in your relationship with Him, I want you to consider inviting Him into your life again. I want you to open the door to your tired heart. And I want you to let Him enter with His bottle spray of healing love. And I want you to give Him an opportunity to just spray over those wounds, to bring you wholeness and to bring you rest. And I want you to pray a different version of the prayer that Jesus prayed on that Thursday night. I want you to say something to the effect of, Lord, I give myself to you with all the faith that I can manage to scrape together today. I no longer seek to understand. It's exhausting. I now seek to trust. I've taken 3 days off in the past week. You didn't even know that. No one misses me when I'm not around. I took 3 days off, and one day in time was dedicated to working in my garden. Come and peek over the fence. It looks stunning, or my handiwork. Anyway, so I want to use some gardening jargon to make my next point as I end. Okay, I want you to fertilize your prayer life in the coming days. I want you to pour some spiritual compost on your relationship with Jesus. And I want you to chisel your trust at that, so that it ends up looking how God wants it to look. Thys, wil jy nie gou vorentoe kom net? I'm closing with this. I can never explain away, with all my theological experience and training and stuff, I can never explain why some people get their prayers answered in the way that they prefer, and why others must wait, and why some people get a no. I can never explain away all the suffering and struggling in the world. It's impossible. But what I do know is that something inside of me tells me emphatically that God can be trusted. So that as you live in expectation of what He's going to do for you in your life, as you live by faith and not by sight, as you try your utmost to trust Him more and more every day, I want you to keep this in mind, that God holds us with the sailor's grip. This is what the sailor's grip looks like. And that even if we slip, if our trust goes through a wobbly and we happen to let go, God doesn't let go of us. God keeps us tight with the sailor's grip. And there's nothing that will happen to you that with Him you will not be able to handle. God treasures you, and God calls you His very own. God says that you are precious and that He is with you, and that no one and nothing can ever change that. And so God holds on to you, His child. And God cannot and will not ever let go. Amen. Amen.